quota deal. But of course, we also now have the freedom to strike new deals with the fastest growing parts of the global economy.
Let's head up to York with Rachel Maskell. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But almost 1 in 6 jobs in Scotland are based in the financial and business services sector, which is dependent on the UK government negotiated trades and service agreement with the EU, having failed to do so before the end of last year. What progress has the Secretary of State and Cabinet colleagues made since leaving the transition arrangements in this area, and what further steps is he taking to ensure that these jobs are secure for the future?
Well, alongside the agreement, we agreed a joint declaration on regulatory cooperation in the area of financial services. The parties will codify this in a memorandum of understanding by March.
Substantive question to the Minister again.
I have frequent discussions with colleagues on the opportunities which COP26 offers for Scotland and the whole of the UK. The Government is committed to delivering an all-of-UK COP26 event in Glasgow. This will bring significant economic benefits to the community in Glasgow and across Britain.
Let's head to Guildford with Angela Richardson. Angela Richardson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Guildford take a keen interest in environmental concerns, and along with me are delighted that Glasgow is hosting COP26 this year. Does my honourable friend agree with me that we are better placed to tackle climate change as a strong union of nations?
My honourable friend is absolutely right in that. And I would also point out to her that while we will be showcasing our global leadership on climate change, and the world's gaze will be on Glasgow, it's disgraceful that the SNP would rather us be pitting community against community in another divisive referendum.
We now come to Prime Minister's questions. And I'm first of all going to call on Ray Manchester. Good morning, Prime Minister. Ray Manchester.
No one, please, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, today on Holocaust Memorial Day, I know that the whole House will want to join me in solemnly remembering the 6 million Jewish men, women and children murdered during the Holocaust and all other victims of Nazi persecution. Last week I had the privilege of hearing from Holocaust survivor Renée Salt and Ian Forsyth, one of the last living British servicemen who liberated the camp at Bergen-Belsen. Their courage to share their testimonies must inspire us all never to forget the Holocaust and to fight against all forms of hatred and prejudice wherever they're found. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
We now have a virtual leader of the opposition. Oh, sorry, Manchester.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I associate myself entirely with all that the Prime Minister has said. Can I thank the Prime Minister and the Government for all their hard work in these difficult and challenging times with regards to the delivery of the COVID-19 vaccination. However, my constituents in Gillingham and Rainham and the wider Medway towns would like me, as their Member of Parliament, to raise their real concerns with regards to the availability of the vaccine in our local towns. We have constituents who are in their 80s, in their 90s, who have not yet had the vaccination. And Medway was one of the hardest hit areas in the country, and the mutant variant was discovered in Kent. And North Kent has some of the highest health inequalities in the country. Can the Prime Minister please ensure that we have the mass vaccination centre in Medway?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I share my honourable friend's sense of frustration about the pace of the vaccine rollout in spite of the fact that we have the fastest rollout anywhere in Europe. It is entirely right that a constituency MP should want to see more done as fast as possible. I can tell him that we've vaccinated more than 80% of those over 80 across the country, and we are looking certainly at a large-scale vaccination centre near him, and in his immediate vicinity we have done 127,000 vaccines already, Mr. Speaker, providing the hope of long-term immunity for the people of Medway and Gillingham and Rainham.
So we head over to a virtual leader of the opposition, Right Honourable Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I begin by joining the Prime Minister in his remarks about Holocaust Memorial Day? This evening, I'll be joining the UK ceremony and lighting a candle to remember the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust along, of course, with the other genocides and persecutions that have taken place around the world. Mr. Speaker, yesterday we passed the tragic milestone of 100,000 COVID deaths in the United Kingdom. That's not just a statistic. Behind every death is a grieving family, a mum, a dad, a sister, a brother, a friend, a colleague, a neighbour. The question on everyone's lips this morning is why? The Prime Minister must have thought about that question a lot. So can he tell us why he thinks that the United Kingdom has ended up with a death toll of 100,000, the highest number in Europe?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, like the right honourable gentleman, I mourn every death in this pandemic, and we share the grief of all those who have been bereaved, Mr. Speaker. And let him be in no doubt, and let the House be in no doubt, that I and the government take full responsibility for all the actions I have taken, we've taken during this pandemic to fight this disease. And yes, Mr. Speaker, there will indeed be a time when we must learn the lessons of what has happened, reflect on them, and prepare, Mr. Speaker. I don't think that moment is now, when we're in the throes of fighting this wave of the new variant, when 37,000 people are struggling with COVID in our hospitals. And I think what the country wants is for us to come together as a parliament and as politicians, and to work to keep the virus under control, Mr. Speaker, as we are, and to continue to roll out the fastest vaccination programme in Europe. I think that is where the minds of the public are fixed.
Turning to Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Prime Minister regrets the fact that 100,000 people have lost their lives. The question is why? Why has the United Kingdom the highest number of deaths in Europe? Why has the United Kingdom a death rate that's higher than almost anywhere in the world? The Prime Minister is going to have to answer that question one day, and he should have the decency to answer it today. A few days ago, the Chief Scientific Officer said, and this was his view, prepared to give it now. The lesson, he said, is you've got to go hard, early and broad if you're going to get on top of this. Waiting and watching simply doesn't work. Does the Prime Minister agree with that?
Mr. Speaker, when you have a new virus, and indeed when you have a new variant of that virus of the kind that we have in this country, when you have dilemmas as hard and as heavy as this government has had to face over the last year, I must tell the right honourable gentleman, there are no easy answers. A perpetual lockdown is no answer, Mr. Speaker. But we will continue to do, as I've said to the House, I've said to you, Mr. Speaker, to do everything we can to roll out our vaccine programme, to give the public the protection that they want and deserve. And as I speak to you today, Mr. Speaker, 6.9 million people in our country have had the vaccine. We're on target, if we can get the supplies, to deliver the target of JCVI 1 to 4, the most vulnerable groups, by the 15th of February. And I hope very much to be in the next a few weeks, Mr. Speaker, to be setting out in much more detail how this country can exit now from the pandemic.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the problem with the Prime Minister avoiding the question of why is that vital lessons won't be learned. The reality is this. The Prime Minister was slow into the first lockdown last March. He was slow in getting protective equipment to the front line, slow to protect our care homes, slow on testing and tracing, slow into the second lockdown in the autumn, slow to change the Christmas mixing rules, slow again into this third lockdown, delaying 13 days from the 22nd of December before implementing it. And I fear that he still hasn't learned that lesson. The latest example is the continued delay in securing our borders. We've known about the variants to the virus since early December when it was announced in the House of Commons. We know some of those variants are coming from abroad, but we don't know the route. Surely the Prime Minister can see that what is required now is that everybody coming into the country from anywhere in the world should be tested and subject to quarantine in a hotel. Why can't that be put in place today?
Mr. Speaker, throughout this pandemic, it's been the habit of the opposition first to support one approach and then to attack it and to twist and to turn. It was only recently that the Shadow Transport Secretary was saying that quarantine measures should be relaxed, Mr. Speaker. We have one of the toughest regimes in the world. We ask people to test 72 hours before they fly. They have to produce a passenger locator form, or otherwise they're kicked off the flight. They already have to quarantine for 10 days. And my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, will be setting out later today, if you care to wait for that, even tougher measures for those red list countries where we are particularly concerned about new variants. And again, I think what the people of this country want for us now to do is to come together as a government, as a parliament, and to get this thing done.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister complains about the opposition, but the greatest criticism of the Prime Minister at the moment in relation to borders is coming from his own Home Secretary. She's busy telling anyone who will listen that the Prime Minister didn't do enough in relation to the borders last year. And I fear that the Prime Minister is repeating the same mistake in relation to the new variants of the virus. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to schools. Everybody agrees that reopening our schools should be a national priority. But that requires a plan. And the Prime Minister hasn't got a plan. So as a first step, does he agree with me that once the first 4 categories of the most vulnerable have been vaccinated by mid-February, he should bring forward the vaccination of key workers and use the window of the February half term to vaccinate all teachers and all school staff?
Mr. Speaker, of course, it follows that all teachers in JCVI groups 1 to 9 will be vaccinated as a matter of priority. And I pay tribute, by the way, to what the huge efforts that parents are making across the country, struggling to educate their kids. I know how deeply frustrating it is, the extra burden that we've placed on families by closing the schools. And no one has worked harder than my honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Education, to keep schools open. We all want to open schools, Mr. Speaker. I think what we want to hear from the Leader of the Opposition is that he will say loudly and clearly what he's refused to say so many times, Mr. Speaker, and what the public need to hear is that schools are safe. It's absolutely critical that he says that.
Keir Starmer.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, I'm none the wiser as to whether the Prime Minister agrees with me that school teachers and school staff should be vaccinated, taking advantage of the February half term. That's 2 or 3 weeks away. It's a fantastic opportunity. And I'm no wiser as to whether the Prime Minister thinks that's a good idea or a bad idea. In the meantime, the government's got a duty to ensure that every single child can learn from home. Without access to a laptop, a computer, or the internet, that can't happen. The government was challenged on this last summer. It was challenged on it last autumn. And here we are, nearly at the end of January, the best part of a year into this pandemic, and a third of families say they don't have enough laptops or home computers. And over 400,000 children still can't get online at home. Does the Prime Minister realise how angry many families are that he still hasn't got to grips with this?
Mr. Speaker, as I said just now, I do fully understand the frustration and impatience of families across the country who are educating their kids at home. And I know how difficult it is. I know how frustrated teachers are with educating remote learning as well. That's why we provided 1.3 million laptops, Mr. Speaker. That's why we've provided a £1 billion catch-up fund. And I will be making a statement to the House in just a few minutes, Mr. Speaker, setting out what more we propose to do with the reopening of schools and the way forward with schools, and what more we propose to do by way of supporting pupils and teachers and parents, Mr. Speaker, if you will just wait a few minutes. But he's missed his opportunity once again to say what I think people need to hear if we are to get schools to reopen, because that is the best thing for pupils and the best thing for families across the country. I would like to hear from the Leader of the Opposition, in defiance of his union paymasters, I'd like to hear that schools are safe.
Don't forget, I just remind the Prime Minister, it's Prime Minister's questions. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, every week the Prime Minister comes with his pre-prepared lines. I think when 100,000 people have died, he should take the time to answer the question. When 1 in 3 families are saying that they don't have enough laptops or computers, his answers are simply not good enough. We're nearly a year into this pandemic. This hasn't happened in the last few weeks, and 1 in 3 families say they don't have the wherewithal to do home teaching, and those children are going without home schooling. That's the question the Prime Minister should be answering. Mr. Speaker, the UK is the first country in Europe to record 100,000 COVID deaths. We also have the deepest recession of any major economy. Our schools are closed and our borders are open. And my biggest concern is that the Prime Minister still hasn't learnt the lessons of last year. And I fear that as a result, we'll see more tragedy and more grim milestones. Now, this afternoon, I will be speaking to families who've lost loved ones to COVID. The last time I did this, I asked the Prime Minister what he would like me to say to them on his behalf. He replied with a pre-prepared childish gag. I could tell the Prime Minister just how badly that went down with those families when I spoke to them later that afternoon. So I'll ask him again, and I hope this time he'll have the decency to answer them properly. What would he like me to say to those bereaved families on his behalf this afternoon?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for meeting the families of the bereaved, as I have done, and I know members across the House have done throughout the pandemic. And it's important that we do that. And the message I would give those families is the same as I've given everybody I've met, is that I, of course, deeply personally regret the loss of life, the suffering of their families, Mr. Speaker. But I think the best thing that we can do to honour the memory of those who have died and to honour those who are currently grieving is to work together to bring this virus down, to keep it under control in the way that we are. And Mr. Speaker, throughout this pandemic, I'm sad to say that the Leader of the Opposition has never failed in his efforts to try to score political points when I think he could be doing just that. And he has twisted and he has turned, and 1 week he calls for tougher border measures after the Shadow Transport Secretary called for looser quarantine. He calls for schools to go back. We won't even say this morning that schools are safe. He tries to associate himself now with the vaccine programme because he senses that may be going well, Mr. Speaker. But he stood on a manifesto to unbundle the pharmaceutical companies, the big pharma, Mr. Speaker, that made those vaccines possible. And he actually attacked the vaccine task force. I know you want me to sit down, Mr. Speaker. I don't want to make this point because I tried to make it last week and you saw me. He even attacked the vaccine task force for spending £675,000 on an effort to discover whether hard-to-reach groups would take a vaccine. And I really cannot think of a better investment right now of public funds. And I hope that later on this afternoon, the Right Honourable Gentleman may think of apologising for what he did and for that attack on the vaccine task force. Mr. Speaker, they can go on, and the Right Honourable Gentleman can go on making his party political points. We will go on, with or without his help, in taking this country forward, fighting the pandemic and getting coronavirus down.
Pauline Latham in Derbyshire. Pauline Latham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The importance of levelling up to constituencies like mine is critical as we look to build back better from COVID. With that in mind, can the Prime Minister commit to delivering the eastern leg of HS2 in full, creating 150,000 jobs and billions of pounds of investment in the Midlands and the North, as well as unlocking the capacity for local transport schemes in Derbyshire, in which cycling and walking must play a crucial part?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and she's right to be militating for the eastern leg of HS2. We'll be publishing the integrated rail plan early this year, and I'm delighted that the Transforming Cities Fund for Nottingham and Derby, £161 million, includes £10 million, Mr. Speaker, for a new cycle route between Nottingham, Derby and East Midlands Airport, and I look forward to cycling it with my honourable friend.
And the Chief Whip, I would expect. We now go to Scotland to Ian Blackford, leader of the SNP. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister on the Holocaust? We all remember the 6 million Jews who lost their life in those terrible crimes against humanity. We should never forget that, nor indeed those that have sadly followed them in genocides around the world. Mr. Speaker, last night, the Prime Minister claimed we truly did everything we could to avoid the deaths of 100,000 people across the UK from COVID-19. But we all know that's simply not true. The UK government response has been defined by a lack of leadership, last-minute U-turns, mixed messaging and devastating policies. All of this has had the effect on the scale of the pandemic. Professor Linda Bald has said that nearly a quarter of all deaths that we've seen have occurred in the last month. Prime Minister, since the start of this pandemic, you've promised to always follow the advice of scientists. Well, this morning, scientists have said that this government is responsible for a legacy of poor decisions during this pandemic. Does the Prime Minister still agree with the scientists?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've throughout followed scientific advice and done everything we can to minimise disease and minimise suffering throughout the country. And I think he would have heard, the Right Honourable Gentleman would have heard my answer to the Leader of the Opposition. There are no easy solutions, Mr. Speaker, when you're facing dilemmas as tragic as the ones being confronted by countries around the world. But I think that everywhere in the UK, if I may say so, Mr. Speaker, can be proud of the efforts now being made by the NHS, by the Army, by volunteers, by pharmacists to roll out the fastest vaccination programme in Europe. That is something that government must do, can do, is doing and will do.
Returning to Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, I must respectfully say that this is not about apportioning blame for honest mistakes, but it is about learning lessons from a Prime Minister who has repeatedly ignored the scientific advice. When we called on the Prime Minister to introduce tough border controls last spring, he refused. When we told the Prime Minister it was a mistake to end lockdown prematurely and push millions of workers back to the office, he ignored us. When we said tough restrictions and full furlough support were still needed, he dithered, delayed and left it too late. People have been asked to make huge sacrifices by his government. At least they now deserve financial certainty. Tell people straight, Prime Minister. Will this UK government extend furlough, maintain the universal credit uplift, and finally offer support for the 3 million excluded? Or will he leave families struggling with the uncertainty while he dithers and delays?
Well, Mr. Speaker, on the subject of dithering and delaying, I'm delighted that the British Army is helping the Scottish government, National Party government, to roll out the vaccine faster, and I think that's extremely important and one of the benefits of the Union of the UK, if I may say so. And on his point, Mr. Speaker, about the support for people and families across this country, I don't think anybody could seriously deny that this government has given absolutely unprecedented and unequalled by global standards support throughout the pandemic. We will continue to put our arms around people across the whole of the UK throughout this crisis.
Let's head to waving it with Peter Aldis. Peter Aldis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The government have put in place an extensive system of support to help employers and employees through the pandemic. However, a group that have been overlooked, many of whom are now really struggling, are those self-employed who set up their own businesses after April 2019 and were unable to submit a complete tax return. 10 months on, this obstacle to providing support no longer applies. To assist them, will the Prime Minister emulate the Northern Ireland government's newly self-employed support scheme, which is subject to straightforward criteria and guards against fraud?
Sir?
My honourable friend is right to raise the concerns that he does, because there are some people in the self-employed groups that it has been hard to reach and to support in the way that we want. They are fewer in number than is sometimes suggested, Mr. Speaker, in this House, and I can tell him that 2.7 million people have self-employed have received support, totaling over 18.5 billion. But the ideas that he suggests, I know, will be taken up by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, and he can expect to hear more on the 3rd of March.
Let's head down to Brighton with Caroline Lucas. Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a yawning gulf between the government's green rhetoric and its action. Hot on the heels of sanctioning the first deep coal mine in 30 years, ministers have broken yet another election manifesto promise and will keep sending plastic waste to developing countries where they're regularly dumped or burnt. 9-year-old schoolgirl Lizzie knows this is wrong, and she has a simple message for the Prime Minister: protect our oceans and people living in poorer countries by banning these dirty plastic exports now. Will he listen to Lizzie and to the 90,000 signatories to her petition and stop this damaging and unethical practice? Yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I must absolutely contest and deny what she has said about action. She talks about coal mines, and she may not know that in 1970, when I was alive, she may not have been alive, this country got 90% of its energy from fossil fuels, from coal, and we now get 5%, Mr. Speaker. That's thanks to the green, active, technologically optimistic policies driven by Conservative governments. And I'm very, very proud of it. I'm also proud of what we're doing to ban plastic and ban the export of plastic waste around the world, which is in our Conservative Party manifesto, Mr. Speaker, and which we will fulfil.
Let's head to Lincolnshire with Holly Mumbycroft. Holly Mumbycroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, David Hopkins, lives with grade 4 glioblastoma. The pioneering immunotherapy treatment he needs is not yet available in the UK. He and his wife, Nikki, continue to fundraise for his treatment in Germany, and I know that the wonderful people of Scunthorpe have been incredibly supportive in this. Will the Prime Minister join me in wishing the Hopkins family well, and will he work with me and the Brain Tumour Charity to improve research and treatments for patients like David?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for what she's doing to campaign for such an excellent charity and indeed for her constituent, David. I can tell her that the Department of Health is working with Tessa Jowell's brain cancer mission and announcing £40 million over 5 years on brain tumours of the type that she describes, and I would encourage my honourable friend to continue the excellent work that she is doing in this area.
Let's head to Scotland with Christine Jardine. Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself and the Liberal Democrats with the Prime Minister's comments on the Holocaust? A year ago next week, in a speech at Greenwich, the Prime Minister said that it was high time that the US cut their punitive tariffs on Scotch whisky. Since then, the industry has lost £500 million in exports to the US, and the government has failed to reach a deal to have the 25% tariff on single malt removed. So will the Prime Minister commit to working urgently with BASE to comply with the WTO rules which led to the issue? And can he promise that in the budget, his government will take steps to support this vital industry and employer?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that my right honourable friend, I don't want to anticipate the budget, Mr. Speaker. I know that my right honourable friend, Chancellor, habitually does things to support fantastic industries such as Scotch whisky. But one of the reasons for leaving the EU, Mr. Speaker, is that we will be able to do a free trade deal with the US and to obviate tariffs of the kind that she describes, which would be there in perpetuity if the Scottish Nationalist Party were to get their way and to take Scotland back into the EU, Mr. Speaker.
Let's head to Kent with Damien Collins. Damien Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, Kent's first COVID mass vaccination centre opened in Folkestone and is working now along with our 3 GP-led hubs in Folkestone, Hythe and Lydd. As we accelerate the delivery of this protection against the virus, does my right honourable friend agree with the Vaccines Minister that we need greater sharing of data at local level so that we can target the resources of the largest vaccination programme in our history at both hard-to-reach groups of individuals and the most vulnerable communities?
Honourable friend makes a very important point, and I know that it's something that everybody wants to see across this House, the sharing of data at local level. And there are particular problems, obviously, Mr. Speaker, with sharing medical records, detailed medical records with local government. But what we are doing is giving public health officials at local level all the information we can give them without breaching that confidentiality to find those hard-to-reach groups and to get them, encourage them to take vaccines. And wonderful work is being done to get people to take vaccines. I encourage all members in your constituencies, get your constituents to take up this offer.
Mr. Speaker, almost 4 years on from the Grenfell tragedy, government inaction on the cladding crisis means that hundreds of thousands of leaseholders, including my constituents, remain trapped in unsafe, unsellable blocks. Ministers have promised at least 15 times that leaseholders won't have to pay unfair costs. But as ever with this government, there's been a lot of promises not matched by delivery. So will the Prime Minister finally act, end this injustice and come forward with a plan to fix the cladding crisis that does not burden leaseholders with the cost?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course we will, and we will. I know that my right friend, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, will be bringing forward a plan very shortly. But it is also important that mortgage companies do not unreasonably refuse mortgages on properties, Mr. Speaker, that are perfectly safe.
Let's head to the Cotswolds with Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown. Sir Geoffrey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This has been an extraordinarily difficult year for both the Prime Minister and the people of this country since the coronavirus was first detected. And their fortitude is being severely tested. And they really need to know when they can get their children back to school and businesses can start to be reopened. So will my right honourable friend assure the House this morning that when he announces his comprehensive plan in mid-February, it will deal with how we lift every area out of their tiers. It will deal with the long-term problems that we're going to have to live with COVID. And furthermore, we will try to avoid making changes in future at 24 hours notice, so that at long last, the people of this country can start to plan their daily lives.
Mr. Speaker, in a few moments or later on this afternoon, I'll be setting out in more detail what my honourable friend, my right honourable friend would like to know about schools, our approach to schools. But then in the course of the next few weeks, assuming the vaccine rollout continues well, assuming that we don't find new variants of concern, we don't have to change our calculations, I will be setting out a broader roadmap for the way forward for the whole country, Mr. Speaker, of a kind I think that my honourable friend and his constituents would appreciate.
Let's head up to Liverpool with Peter Dowd. Peter Dowd.
A war widow's pension for 67 years. My mother received one for 49 years. 2 of my nephews are veterans and a veterans network operates in my constituency. I know they would agree that a pension should be paid at the UK rate wherever a veteran or any pensioner lives in the world. When will 96-year-old Anne Puckridge, a World War II veteran who lives in Canada, and 60,000 other veterans who serve their country courageously and live abroad stop being treated as second-class veterans and get the full pension they deserve? So will he commit to ending this injustice? Will he agree to meet with representatives of the End Frozen Pensions campaign? Mr. Speaker, as a start, that's the very least the British Prime Minister could do for Britain's greatest generation.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for raising this issue and this this problem. I've come across it before, but the case he describes is obviously acute, and I will ensure that he gets the meeting he desires with the relevant minister.
Let's head to Hastings with Sally Ann Hart. Sally Ann Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency, Chapman's of Rye is acting as an export hub for consignments of local fish going across the English Channel, but it's proving extremely challenging, expensive and time-consuming. Mr. Chapman is creating an opportunity to develop Rye as a vital export hub for Kent and Sussex fishermen. However, he's burdened with red tape. What steps is my right honourable friend taking to support opportunities like those in Rye to make exporting easier? And would the Prime Minister accept an invitation to visit this fantastic enterprise?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to her for raising this, because this in the last few weeks this has been an issue for many fishing businesses, many fishers and fishing communities, and there has been too much red tape, and what we're doing is providing an immediate £23 million to help businesses with problems that they're encountering through no fault of their own. But we're also investing £100 million in a long-term programme for the UK fishing industry to help with equipment, to help with processing, and enable this country to be in a position to take advantage of the incredible access to our fisheries that we will have as the years go by.
Let's head up to Scotland with Stephen Bonner. Stephen Bonner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister now do the right thing? Commit to making the £20 a week uplift to universal credit permanent, or will he be responsible for pushing thousands of Scottish families further into an income crisis?
Mr. Speaker, I repeat what I've said before. We will continue to look after the people of this country throughout this pandemic, and it's a feature of the strength of the UK Treasury that we can continue to do this.
Christian Wakeford.
Mr. Speaker, I commend the Prime Minister in reaffirming his commitment to levelling up the nation, and the best way to level up is through a good local education. The town of Radcliffe in my constituency has been without a high school since 2014, and as the bidding process for 3 schools remains in the final stages, will my right honourable friend the Prime Minister help by supporting my campaign alongside the people of Radcliffe for the new school that the town desperately needs?
Well, I thank my honourable friend, who's a fantastic campaigner for his constituents, and I can tell him that we are indeed looking at expanding the free school programme. Wave 14 of free schools will be announced very shortly, and I hope that he won't have too long to wait.
Returning to Merseyside with Bill Esterson. Bill Esterson.
Alison Powell's tax return showed that she was paid £10 more for her earnings as an employee than her earnings in self-employment. As a result, she didn't qualify and still doesn't qualify for any financial support. It's no good the Prime Minister saying that his government has done whatever it takes. As the IFS says just today, 1.8 million self-employed people and 700,000 owner-managers have not had financial support. So when is the government going to start supporting those who've been financially excluded so that Alison Powell and millions of people like her can afford to stay at home and play their part in restricting this virus while the vaccine is rolled out?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I am conscious, as the honourable gentleman says, that there have been difficult cases with self-employed people who haven't qualified for some of the support that we've offered. I'd invite him to send the details of Alison's case to us, and we'll see what we can do. But I must remind the House that we've spent about £18 billion supporting self-employed people, Mr. Speaker, throughout this pandemic. And as I say, we will continue to put our arms around the British people for the duration of the crisis.
To Peterborough with Paul Bristow. Paul Bristow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents recognise the need for lockdown, but are increasingly concerned about their mental health. Many of them asked me to raise this today. On Monday, over 20 Peterborough school children told me how it was affecting them. They'd organised their own mental health summit with me and the local CCG. Does the Prime Minister agree that the country's mental health is suffering and should be a factor in deciding when to end specific restrictions?
Mr. Speaker, I know the stress that people are under, and not just school pupils, and he's right to raise that, but particularly NHS workers during this current wave of the pandemic. It has been really grueling the last few weeks and months, and we are investing hugely in mental health support, another 13.3 billion in 2019. On top of the 2019-20, we'll see a further 2.3 billion a year by 2023-2024, and that will support 380,000 adults and 345,000 children, Mr. Speaker.
Final question from South Wales from Carolyn Harris. Carolyn Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the Prime Minister has already said today he will take full responsibility for all the actions his government has taken during the pandemic, will he confirm that this will include the woeful and reckless management of the COVID outbreak at the DVLA government sites in my constituency? And will he also ensure that his Transport Secretary is held accountable for the inexcusable damage and devastation that this has caused?
I thank the Honourable Lady for raising the question with me, and may I offer her, by the way, my condolences, Mr. Speaker, on the death of her father. I can tell her that we've been working flat out on the problem at the DVLA, and all staff who can work from home are doing so. Measures have been taken to minimise the number of people on the site at any one time, and more than 2,000 tests have been carried out by the DVLA in the last fortnight alone, Mr. Speaker, with all the results so far coming back negative.
I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes to enable the necessary arrangements for the next business. Order.